what would be a realistic setting for a floating castle upon a floating piece of rock, like a floating castle? Like, what would be a realistic setting for that? I mean, magic would allow someone you can get the rocks, right, to levitate because of magic. Something inside the rocks is levitating magical stone or whatever, right? And it levitates. But if you already have a floating island, what's the point of building a castle? Because castles, they're defensive structures with very tall walls. So wouldn't it make more sense to make pyramids? Because pyramids would be defended on all sides, right? Because they're a literal wall that sticks out of the ground. So it doesn't really make any sense for it to be a castle. Not unless if someone already built the castles on the ground, and then because of mining of magical ore or whatever, the ground all of a sudden separated and started levitating. Or maybe someone tried to cast a spell and tried to directly pull the magic out of the ores, and these castles that are flying are castles built to defend the mining operation upon these stones. So you would have the sky people be miners. Okay, now what about how do you get down? How do you get up? Well, if you have a magician that's been fucking around with the magical ore, like the magician should be able to whip up some sort of magic carpet, right? So that you can be levitated, flown down and up, right? So you have all these miners, and if you mine too much of the ore, well, that's kind of bad for you. Except if you have the miners on the ground, working on the ground in these pits that have been left from the castles being ripped from the ground, then you just have the miners working in these giant caves, these giant pits, and they're harvesting magic stone from their surroundings, and they're putting it on these carpets, later baskets. Because if you can do a magic carpet, you can do 2 magic carpets, or 5 or 6, and so you have baskets that can be lifted up, or whatever, right? So you set up these baskets with a bunch of magic carpets, and you put the stones on the carpets, and you levitate it up to the castle. Or you just levitate it up to a new 45 post, and yeah, like you have these wider walls built up from the wealth that you accumulate by selling more magical stones. I mean, that's like the most realistic thing to do to justify a floating castle or a floating fortress, because why do you have tall walls on a floating fortress like that? And the actual floating fortress, well, the walls aren't really necessary to defend against anything. So what you would do, in my opinion, is just build up more things on the side of the wall. So you have all these apartments around the wall, because you're now housing more and more people. Maybe royal people, maybe noble people that come to visit you. So that's how you end up with a pseudo-medieval village, essentially, floating above the ground on a piece of rock. Wizards carry you up and down using magic carpets that they make using the magical stones, and because you rip the castle from its foundations, you have all access to this wealth of magical stones. And that just secures your empire around you. And other people imitate you, so you end up with multiple empires with floating fortresses. And some of these floating fortresses don't have any castles, and some of these floating fortresses are literally cave cities. because they just built the structures inside of the caves and unnecessary rock was tossed away, right? And you would use wood as a luxury on these things. And you would have people growing trees or growing branches or whatever, growing cob, growing whatever. And maybe you would have dragons make some of these floating stones, other floating stones that people didn't have access to. Dragons could make that their homes. Like, I've never seen a dragon live inside of a cave upon a floating giant rock. Like, that is something that I feel like should absolutely be part of fantasy. But I never see it. And it's like, why the hell aren't there any dragons living inside caves, inside floating rocks? It seems like the most obvious, logical thing to have with dragons, because they're magical creatures and floating rocks suggest magical stones or whatever, and it's like the most logical thing you could expect to do with a dragon in a fantasy setting, you know?